Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking an incredible journey right back to the very hinge of the 20th century. We're diving directly into the mind of a man whose ideas didn't just influence naval policy, they really fundamentally restructured global strategy for generations.
Absolutely. We're talking about Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan.
That's right, and specifically his, well, remarkably prescient 1902 collection of essays, Retrospect and Prospect, Studies in International Relations, Naval and Political.
And this isn't just, dry historical naval theory. This material captures the exact pivotal moment when the United States kind of stopped debating its isolation and really started to understand its inevitable, expansive, global role.
Yeah.
Mahan, he was already a living legend, right? Thanks to the seismic impact of the influence of sea power upon history. What he offers here isn't just a look back, a retrospective, but a genuine geopolitical forecast, right there at the cusp of truly modern international policy.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We want to extract what Mahan saw coming way back in 1902. We need to identify which of his forecasts, about strategy, empire, political change, which ones became these permanent geopolitical truths. And maybe just as important, which of his analytical methods still hold up more than a century later. We're essentially getting a shortcut to global strategy, but through the eyes of the master.
And there's a really unique insight we get into the genesis of this book itself. Mahan makes a key point right in the preface. He says these essays were largely not initiated by him.
Right, they were commissioned.
Exactly. Requested by influential magazine editors, big names at the time like The World's Work, McClure's Magazine, The National Review.
And that distinction is, well, it's crucial, isn't it? Because it changes the whole context. This wasn't Mahan just sitting down to, polish his existing theories.
Not at all.
These were responses to a national fever, almost. The editors saw the American consciousness was shifting dramatically, and they needed the biggest authority on sea power to articulate, to organize what this sudden expansion actually meant.
That's it, exactly. It shows these essays reflect not just, as he puts it, the trend of a single mind, but the emerging high-level national conversation that was demanding definition. Mahan was essentially providing the vocabulary for the new American empire. And the overarching theme he identifies right away is one of sudden, discontinuous, really momentous change.
He opens the collection with this almost structural observation that these huge fortune-directing events seem to cluster quite dramatically around the end of conventional centuries. Like there's some kind of historical rhythm.
Yeah, and he wasn't just talking about coincidences. He was genuinely looking for patterns in world history. He brings up specific historical evidence to back this up.
Like the 1490s.
Exactly. Think about that decade. You've got the discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope, and the consolidation of the Spanish monarchy with the fall of Granada, all happening basically at once.
Wow.
These were simultaneous, mutually reinforcing events that just irrevocably altered the global balance, changed everything.
And the next cluster he points to is just as dramatic, isn't it?
Just as dramatic. The period leading up to and including 1600. The absolute key event there is 1588, the destruction of the Spanish Armada.
Right.
That moment fundamentally signaled the eventual downfall of Spain's whole colonial empire and at the same time, the rise of English sea power. It shifted the center of gravity in the world. Mahan's arguing that these centuries don't just end neatly on a calendar date, they conclude when the fundamental power dynamics actually shift.
Which brings us right up to his own time. He argues that the decade between 1890 and 1900 fits this exact pattern. These were fortune-directing events, specifically defining the future course of the United States.
Absolutely. He highlights what he calls the singular dramatic effect of the final disappearance of Spain's colonial empire after, 4 long centuries?
Yeah, 400 years.
Spain? This is a state that once held an ascendancy over England that even powerful France never quite attained. And now, boom, stripped of its overseas possessions, forced back entirely upon itself. But the real importance of this catastrophe, in Mahan's strategic view, isn't about Spain.
It's about the U.S.
It's about his forced influence on the United States. That's the game changer.
And this marks a huge personal realization for Mahan, too, doesn't it? He actually admits that this change forced the U.S. to look outward in a way that was, and quoting him here, far beyond any consciousness than possible to the writer just 12 years earlier.
It's a remarkable admission, really, for a student of history to suddenly witness history accelerating beyond even his own projections.
He was analyzing history, and then suddenly, wham, he's right in the middle of a strategic revolution himself.
Exactly. The United States, which had spent, a better part of a century trying its best to avoid foreign entanglement, was suddenly an Atlantic power, a Caribbean power, and a Pacific power, all at the same time. It was a whole new world.
That realization brings us perfectly into part one, the U.S. really looking outward, Spain's final fall, specifically losing Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. That was the shock treatment the American political system, frankly, needed. It was just impossible to continue as before.
It really was a reckoning with tradition, wasn't it?
Mm.
Mahan says it forced the U.S. into reconsidering some of the postulates that were supposed fundamental and irreversible in its whole scheme of national existence.
Right.
Old order of isolation just sort of yielded. It gave place to this new reality of international responsibility, whether they were ready for it or not.
So that core American tradition of isolationism, this idea that the U.S. could just remain safely in its, what did he call it, its little corner,
Yeah, the little corner.
that was suddenly just obsolete. Mahan talks about the, quote, Bible of American political tradition needing new light thrown upon it, which necessitates new criticism.
And this is a profoundly philosophical point for a military strategist to be making, right?
Sure.
He argues that true obedience is due to the spirit, not the literal letter, of ancestral political tradition.
Training.
Meaning, okay, isolationism was understood back in the day as avoiding these destructive European wars and entanglements. That made sense then. But the popular understanding of that idea had become, imperfect or even exaggerated under the clearer light of advancing experience. The nation had grown up.
Right.
Its resources were vast, its potential was huge, and its policy had to mature with it. It had to shift from just self-preservation to, global responsibility.
The whole passive defense mindset was shattered. Mahan even uses that dismissive phrase from a French admiral from just a few years before, describing the U.S. as the Jack Horner of nations.
Yeah, sitting in its little corner, congratulating itself on not needing military preparation. That state of atrophy, the kind of comfortable complacency, was just gone overnight.
Yeah.
And Mahan is really careful in his analysis here to distinguish cause from symptom. He points out that the crucial renewal of the U.S. Navy actually began about 15 years earlier, around 1887.
Okay.
He calls it an opportune renewal because it happened, quote, without visible immediate urgency. It was like this preparation that reflected an almost unconscious national tendency toward wider influence. But then, when the political cloud, the Spanish-American War, suddenly appeared,
The Navy was there.
the Navy was there, ready to go.
So the military capability didn't cause the expansion. It just provided the means when the political necessity or maybe the opportunity offered by Spain's collapse arrived. The Navy was almost a reflection of America's maybe unacknowledged destiny.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it. Mahan then structures this whole change not just as internal development, but as explicit extension. He identifies 4 primary ways the U.S. expanded in that crucial decade between 1890 and 1900.
Okay, let's break those down because they really define that transition into the 20th century. First, the most visible one, territorial expansion.
Yeah, that's the obvious one. The material acreage, you could say, acquiring the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. And crucially, these were not contiguous territories.
Right, across oceans.
Exactly. They required projecting power across vast oceans, which inherently, fundamentally changes the security calculus of the entire nation.
Okay, second, the most abstract, maybe, but perhaps the most important change, political thought extension.
This involved establishing relations not heretofore admitted as compatible with our scheme of existence. That's his phrase.
So moving beyond just non-interference.
Way beyond. It meant accepting the need for permanent foreign garrisons, engaging in colonial governance, something totally new for the U.S., and entering into that complex web of European and Asian diplomacy that the U.S. had for so long actively shunned. It really forced a national debate about who Americans were and what responsibilities they were actually willing to bear.
Third, the practical necessity that follows from the first two, naval expansion.
Yeah, this was, as he says, necessarily entailed by the changed conditions in the new territories. You simply cannot maintain and support transmarine acquisitions, especially vulnerable island chains, without dominant sea power. It's just impossible. This extension was the direct corollary of the first two.
And fourth, the one Mahan seems, almost most passionate about because it connects his strategic thought directly to economics, commercial reciprocity expansion. This was promoting a pretty radical shift in American trade policy.
Indeed. It's fascinating how much ink Mahan, the naval strategist, dedicates to economic policy. But for him, naval power and commerce were like two sides of the same coin, inextricably linked. His line of thought leads him directly to advocating for freedom of trade, or at least moving decisively away from the rigid protectionism that had really dominated post-Civil War American policy.
Because the U.S. was still operating behind these massive tariff walls, right? Designed to protect its own burgeoning domestic industries. But Mahan saw that policy as just incompatible with America's new global reach.
Totally incompatible. He pulls out that great quote from Secretary of State James Blaine, who said, "It is not an ambitious destiny for so great a country to manufacture only what we can consume or produce only what we can eat."
Wow, that's a powerful quote.
Isn't it? It's a direct philosophical challenge to that whole isolationist, protectionist mindset of the 19th century. Blaine was basically arguing that the U.S. had grown up. It had matured beyond needing this kind of economic safety blanket.
It frames protectionism as a destiny that's just too small for a nation like America.
Exactly. It's a critique of ambition, or lack thereof. Mahan points out that even really staunch protectionists, like President McKinley himself, were being forced toward reciprocity agreements just by the sheer volume of American production. They were making too much stuff to sell only at home.
Okay.
Reciprocity, Mahan points out, it's far from free trade. It still involves tariffs and negotiations, but it crucially abandons the viewpoint of exclusive interest, which he calls the citadel of protection. It embraces the concept of mutual benefit. It's an acknowledgement that you have to engage the global market, not just defend your home turf.
So why does the naval strategist care so deeply about whether the U.S. has high tariffs or reciprocity agreements? What's the connection for him?
Because Mahan sees protectionism as inherently passive, defensive. He states very clearly that in all struggles, whether it's commerce or war, it is not defensive action but offensive conquest, expansion which ultimately wins. Protection removes that competitive pressure, the thing that drives innovation and efficiency, because it guarantees an adequate home market. You get comfortable.
You're basically sitting on your hands, economically speaking, while the rest of the world is out there fighting for market share.
Exactly. Mahan argues that expansion, conversely, demands competitive excellence. It demands outward movement, pushing American goods and, yes, American influence overseas. Reciprocity, which opens markets on a mutual basis, is the logical corollary of that necessary expansion. If you expand your territory and you expand your navy, you absolutely must follow up with an expanded commercial policy. They are, for him, a continuous chain. One necessitates the other.
That connects perfectly back to the naval necessity argument. Opponents of territorial expansion were technically correct, Mahan admits this, that these new transmarine acquisitions would be exposed points, supported only by sea power.
Yeah, they were right on that narrow point.
And they were right that stationary fortifications are cheaper for just passive coast defense.
They won the argument on, let's say, localized military expenditure. Definitely. But where they failed strategically, Mahan argues, was their failure to note that even when not possessing a square foot of territory without its borders, the U.S. already had manifold interests abroad.
Such as?
Shipping lanes, commercial treaties, missionaries, citizens traveling. All of these things were already out there, globally, and they were protectable only by a navy.
Okay. So the Philippines didn't create the need for a great navy out of thin air.
Not at all. The need already existed to protect American interests globally. It just hadn't been fully acknowledged or acted upon.
I see.
The necessity for a great navy, Mahan argues, rests upon the global extension of commerce by political pressure, which he calls a leading element in the spirit of the times. This necessity was becoming particularly urgent in South America, where the Monroe Doctrine was basically hot air without naval teeth to back it up,
Right.
and also in the rapidly growing markets of Eastern Asia and the Pacific.
And here's the really neat strategic twist he adds. Mahan argues the new possessions, the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, they haven't actually increased the burden of naval defense. Instead, they've reduced the weight of the burden by contributing to support it.
This is the classic forward-based calculation, isn't it? Before the Philippines, think about it, a U.S. naval force operating way out in Asia had to rely entirely on foreign powers for repairs, for coal, for everything.
Yeah, that's a huge disadvantage.
Huge. Now, with Hawaii and the Philippines, the U.S. has its own vital forward bases, coaling stations, repair facilities. They turn the immense logistical challenge of the Pacific Ocean into a sequence of manageable distances. It actually makes the defense of U.S. interests cheaper and faster than it would be if all support had to be shipped laboriously from the West Coast.
So the new territory justified the naval expansion, subsidized it, and ultimately made the pre-existing necessity easier to manage.
Precisely. It closed the loop. The strategy, the territory, the navy, the commerce, it all had to work together.
Okay, moving to part two. We shift fully onto the global stage, confirming the U.S. is now, well, an irrevocable player. For the year 1901, when he's writing this, Mahan says the living external issue is clearly Eastern Asia, specifically China. And this just showcases the incredible speed of that strategic shift we were talking about. The U.S. went from rejecting the annexation of Hawaii in 1893 to possessing the Philippines just 8 years later. That forced its attention directly onto the complex balance of power in Asia.
And Mahan immediately zooms in on geography, which is always, always the foundation of his analysis. Specifically, the great stream and valley of the Yangtze-Kiang River.
The Yangtze.
He identifies this river system as the natural focus of trade for the richer, the most populated, and the most productive part of the entire Chinese empire.
Why the Yangtze specifically? I mean, compared to other rivers or coastal cities in China.
It's about navigability, deep water navigability. Mahan highlights that it is navigable for seagoing vessels for 1,000 miles inland.
1,000 miles, wow.
Yeah, think about that. This isn't just, shallow river barges. This means that maritime powers with real navies, can project deep into the Chinese interior.
Yeah.
They can effectively assert both commercial and military force far, far from the coast.
So it's the perfect conduit for trade.
And the single most critical choke point for controlling central Chinese commerce. It is the area where the maritime powers can, as he puts it, effectually assert their force against continental rivals.
Like Russia.
Primarily Russia at this point, yes. Their overland expansion was the big counterforce.
And this geographical imperative leads Mahan to an explicit call for, well, power alignment. He argues the U.S. absolutely must cooperate with Great Britain.
He calls Britain the greatest of naval states.
Right.
And the rationale isn't sentiment. It's not, shared heritage, though that existed. It's pure, calculated geopolitical interest. Britain is fundamentally a free trade nation. Therefore, her aim must be to increase the volume of commerce in China. That supports the open door policy. It supports China's independence against being carved up by other powers. And this policy is directly aimed against, quote, the encroachments of another people, of whose policy exclusive trade is a dominant factor.
That's a pretty clear shot at Russia.
Oh, it's unmistakable. Russia's continental expansion, especially their new railways, like the Trans-Siberian, was tied directly to protective tariffs and creating exclusive economic zones, basically shutting out rivals wherever they could.
So Britain and the U.S. had a shared interest in keeping China open.
Exactly. And for the same reasons that shared interest in open commerce, Mahan suggests the U.S. is also kind of impelled to act in unison with Germany and Japan, who also benefited from open markets. He concludes with this very straightforward statement of fact. As the world is now balanced, the British Empire is in external matters our natural, though not our formal ally.
Interesting phrasing. Natural, though not formal.
Yeah, it's not a plea for a treaty alliance, not yet anyway. It's a recognition of a permanent alignment of fundamental interests, based on sea power and free trade principles versus continental power and protectionism.
Okay, but Asia isn't the only focal point that caught Mahan's strategic eye at this time. He then shifts his gaze to a region that, in 1902 was still relatively quiet on the surface, but was about to explode with strategic importance, the Persian Gulf.
Mahan's analysis of the Persian Gulf in this essay is just, well, it's startlingly prophetic. He identifies its critical military importance because it is destined, he sees, to be the terminus of a prospective interoceanic railroad, the Euphrates Valley Line, sometimes called the Berlin-Baghdad Railway.
Okay.
In its strategic attributes, he says the Gulf is closely analogous to Port Arthur.
That analogy needs unpacking. Why Port Arthur specifically? That was way up in China.
Right. Port Arthur was this key naval base and, crucially, a rail terminus on the Liaodong Peninsula. It was fought over intensely by Russia and Japan precisely because it was a classic pinch point, where continental power, Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway reaching the sea, met naval power.
Ah, I see.
Controlling the Persian Gulf, like controlling Port Arthur, means controlling the point where a major rail line projecting continental influence deep from the interior finally terminates at the sea. Control of that terminus involved commercial and military security for immense regions specifically, the vast interior of the Middle East, and, critically for Britain, the security of India.
And given the power vacuum there at the time he mentions Persia, Turkey, the local Arab communities are all too weak to ensure stability. Mahan argues the responsibility for the Gulf sort of defaults onto the, quote, next of kin.
Yeah, the next of kin, which in this case he argues unequivocally is Great Britain. Britain is first, that is most concerned. And he breaks down exactly why, listing 3 core factors.
Okay, what are they?
First, pretty obviously, India's security. An adverse change in Gulf control, say, another major power like Russia or Germany establishing a heavily fortified naval base there, would materially affect India, which Britain considered this enormous, vital, but also politically helpless ward of the empire. India's defense, in their view, started far, far from its actual shores.
Right, makes sense. Second factor.
The safety of the sea route to India and beyond.
The Suez route.
Exactly. Once ships pass through the Suez Canal, the Persian Gulf flanks all the primary routes heading east to India, to Australia, to the Far East. If a hostile power were established in the Gulf, Mahan argues, even if Britain could eventually contain that fleet, it would require a permanent detachment of British naval power so large that it would affect seriously the general strength of her naval position everywhere else in the world.
Wow, it would tie them down.
It would tie down a huge portion of the fleet, just protecting the throat of these vital trade routes. That's a permanent geographical factor you can't ignore.
Okay, and the third factor is specifically about trade protection for India itself.
Yes, the economic welfare of India. India needed, Mahan argued, untrammeled commercial intercourse with Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and Persia for its own trade. Since many competing nations, preeminently Russia, adopted these highly protective or exclusive trade policies, British naval predominance in the Gulf served a crucial function. It excluded foreign arsenals and foreign protective policies that would injure Indian trade. It ensured India's, quote, natural rights of commerce were secured by British force.
This strategic analysis immediately bumps up against the complication of the German factor, though. You mentioned the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. German capitalists had secured concessions for that railway, heading deep into Mesopotamia, aiming for the Gulf. How did Mahan view this German push? It wasn't Russia, but it was another potential rival.
He definitely recognizes it as a powerful development, especially coming from Germany, a nation geographically far more removed from the region than Russia was. But interestingly, he doesn't immediately condemn it or see it as an existential threat.
Yeah.
No, he actually sees potential for achieving a kind of political equipoise, a balance. His idea was, if Britain were to wisely encourage British capital to develop the Gulf communications themselves, the ports, the docks, local feeder lines, then the German railway, when it finally arrived, would ultimately terminate in a British system.
Ah, so the British would control the final mile, the access to the sea, and the port facilities.
Exactly. Mahan notes this is actually a pretty non-unusual international relation. Think of railways crossing borders elsewhere. The core strategic idea for him was twofold. First, the vital Suez route needed protection primarily against Russian expansion from the north. Second, Germany, by developing a Mesopotamian railway, was actually contributing to opening up the hinterland, which ultimately benefits free trade, so long as the maritime terminus, the port in the Gulf, remains open and non-exclusive under British influence.
It's a very pragmatic, almost opportunistic balancing act he's suggesting.
Very pragmatic. But despite this urge to engage in complex balancing, Mahan offers this really clear and crucial warning against diplomatic haste. And he roots it directly in the teachings of the American founders, particularly Washington.
What's the warning?
This is where his broader political philosophy comes through. Policy, he advises, must conform to the natural course of things, consulting, not resisting their course. He warns explicitly against forcing nothing.
Don't rush things.
Don't rush things. Arrangements that are born prematurely or artificially, like treaties made just because you fear some imminent hostile combination that might not even materialize, are, quote, disregardful of permanent conditions and are fundamentally unsound. He reminds us that Washington himself advised against contriving an opportunity, meaning we should wait for strategic opportunities to present themselves naturally based on the unfolding of events and those permanent geographical factors, rather than trying to force them through excessive fear or overly aggressive diplomacy. Sound policy waits for the alignment of permanent conditions. It doesn't try to create them out of wishful thinking or anxiety.
Okay, part 3 now takes us away from the fixed factors of geography and more into the shifting perceptions of national strength. We're looking at the internal health of the British Empire, specifically analyzing its prestige following that really difficult and drawn-out South African War, the Boer War, which had concluded just before Mahan compiled these essays.
Yeah, and Mahan feels he needs to first ground the conversation by defining prestige, because it's actually critical to naval and diplomatic success, but it's slippery. He calls it a dangerous concept, noting it often involves illusion or even of delusion.
Hmm. Illusion.
Yeah, it's the popular impression, resting often on just surface appearance, which makes it, in his words, among the most uncertain of possessions. And yes, the Boer War, because of its initial setbacks, its length, the sheer difficulty of it, it caused a definite impression abroad of British bafflement, maybe even failure. And this was fueled, Mahan notes, by widespread continental European and American prepossession against Britain. There was a lot of anti-British sentiment out there.
And that bias maybe led people to forget the immense permanent difficulties of the war itself. Mahan makes sure to list those mitigating operational conditions that Britain faced.
He does. He identifies three huge challenges that were just baked into the situation. First, the sheer remoteness of baseline. We're talking 6,000 miles of sea communication. That logistical tail is just enormous.
It has some miles, yeah.
Second, the nature of the country itself. Vast, extensive, sparsely settled, often very difficult territory. This required the British military to depend almost entirely on these vulnerable, long, single-track railroads to supply their forces, sometimes 1,000 miles inland from the ports.
A logistical nightmare.
Truly. And the third factor is the unique nature of the enemy they faced, the Boer commandos.
Right. They weren't a conventional army.
Not at all. Their Boer character, as Mahan terms it, was a strategic challenge in itself. They had extremely simple wants, they were capable of incredibly rapid movement on horseback, and they maintained a low type of social and political cohesion, which made them hard to pin down. Mahan compares their elusiveness to that of North American Indians.
Okay.
But with the critical addition of the white man's intelligence, including modern rifles, modern tactics, and a deep understanding of the terrain. They weren't fighting set-piece battles. They were masters of fluid, dispersed guerrilla warfare, something the conventional British military was really ill-prepared for at the start.
So Mahan argues that just focusing on the setbacks, the surrenders, the difficulties ignores the truly impressive logistical effort the British actually pulled off.
He does criticize aspects of the war. He calls the strategic execution less than admirable in certain tactical areas. But when you look at the big picture, the logistics transferring over 165,000 men, plus all their horses, guns, ammunition, food, everything, 6,000 miles across the ocean, and then distributing and supplying them up to 1,000 miles inland using those precarious single-track railroads, all within about 8 months of the initial outbreak that, he argues, is a massive demonstration of industrial and naval capability.
Yeah, that's staggering.
It was a feat of supply and control that very few, if any other powers in the world at that time could have managed. It showed the underlying strength, even if the prestige took a temporary hit.
But he's not shy about internal criticism either, is he? He notes that widespread impression of incompetence, particularly in subordinate duties, especially among the officer corps.
No, he doesn't shy away from that at all. He absolutely dismisses the sensationalist idea of a decay in the fighting quality of the race. He thinks that's absurd, pointing to the abundant courage shown by the ordinary soldiers. The real defect, he observes, is professional. The average British officer, he says, is not instrued.
Instrued, meaning?
Well-read, trained, deeply grounded in military theory and history. He sees it as a historical issue in the British Army, a reliance on sort of gentlemanly courage and playing fields rather than rigorous professional preparation. And this lack of deep study led to numerous costly surprises, unnecessary surrenders, tactical blunders. He warns very directly that the student's lamp, as well as the football field, is absolutely required for modern military command. You need brains as well as bravery.
So if there was some loss of external prestige, that illusion of effortless British superiority, what was the great permanent gain for the empire from this costly war?
The immeasurable assurance of national power, he argues, came from fostering unanimity in the nation, centering around the idea of imperialism. The war required the active involvement and sacrifice of the major self-governing colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, sending troops.
Right, the colonials fought alongside the British.
Exactly. That shared effort, that shared sacrifice, powerfully strengthened the imperial tie. It provided tangible assurance of local support, critically naval bases around the world, and it provided battle-experienced colonial troops for future crises. Ultimately, Mahan believed it made the empire's strategic foundations surer and more unified than before the war.
And this newfound unity, this practical demonstration of imperial cooperation, becomes the main impetus for the idea of Imperial Federation, which Mahan saw as the necessary political corollary to the military cooperation seen in South Africa.
Yes, the war provided this really concrete, recent example of the imperial connection's specific utility, especially to the large colonies like those in South Africa, when facing a powerful, internal but alien state like the Boer Transvaal Republic. They needed the empire's help.
And he draws a direct and very deliberate analogy to the formation of the United States itself.
He does. The goal of federation, he states quite clearly, is precisely the same goal as the American Constitution achieved, quote, to assure unified or imperial external action, while preserving the independence of the several parts in their internal affairs.
Centralized foreign policy and defense, but local autonomy otherwise.
Exactly. He sees it as the highest form of political organization, this balancing act, reconciling the absolute need for central authority in foreign policy and defense with the desire for local independence in domestic matters.
But that analogy immediately hits a major geographical and political barrier, doesn't it? Ireland. Ireland was demanding home rule, which would effectively grant it internal independence, similar to Canada or Australia.
And Mahan is absolutely unequivocal here, arguing purely from a naval security perspective. Ireland, he says, is the single stark exception to the kind of homogeneity that he believes must exist among the potential core federated bodies like Canada, Australia, etc. Geographically, he argues, Ireland's independence would be fatal to any scheme of federation, and even more strongly would manacle Great Britain.
Manacle Great Britain. Why such incredibly strong language?
It boils down to proximity and strategic location. In any major naval war, Ireland's geographical position flanking Britain's vital western approaches, the main routes for trade and reinforcement from the Atlantic, is indispensable. If Ireland were independent, even if it were technically neutral, Mahan argues a hostile power could easily use its territory, its harbors, or its adjacent waters as a base for naval operations, for submarine warfare, which was just emerging, or for logistical interference against Britain. Ireland's sheer proximity, in his view, fundamentally demands the legislative supremacy of the British Parliament over defense and external policy matters related to Ireland. That control, he believed, simply could not be yielded without endangering the security of the entire empire.
So, for Mahan, naval security trumped the internal political aspirations of Ireland in this specific, unique geographical case.
That's his cold, hard strategic calculus, yes.
So the goal of federation, as he envisions it, is not really an empire of equals negotiating treaties amongst themselves, but rather a singular political entity for external purposes. Mahan clarifies what the structure would look like.
Yeah, he suggests Imperial Federation is not so much a federated empire as a federal state or kingdom. He pictures it composed of maybe half a dozen principal members, Britain, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, who are, importantly, substantially homogeneous in their principles of government.
A core group.
Or group. This federal kingdom would then exercise unified external policy and defense, and it would rule collectively over the subordinate dependencies, like India or other colonies, which weren't ready for self-government. The self-governing colonies gain a voice in foreign policy, which they didn't really have, but the sovereignty for external action remains centralized.
And what are the benefits? What are the economic and security advantages for the members of this proposed federal kingdom?
Well, for the colonies, Canada, Australia, etc., the tie provides crucial security, especially naval protection from the Royal Navy, without which they'd be pretty vulnerable to any major power trying to exert influence. It also provides wider scope they get to share in the prestige and the foreign policy determination of a true world power.
Okay. And for Britain, the mother country.
For the mother country, the younger and poorer members, as he puts it, are admitted into a long-standing wealthy firm. This potentially shares the immense financial burden of imperial defense, which Britain largely carried alone. And this benefit was seen concretely, Mahan argues, in the UK's massive expenditure on the South African War, which essentially saved the South African colonies from destruction by the Boers, an act Mahan viewed as the proper discharge of a great imperial obligation by the senior partner. It showed the system could work, albeit expensively.
Shifting now to part 4, we transition back to pure military theory, examining Mahan's core principles of naval strategy and also the critical, almost spiritual nature of obedience in military command.
Mahan grounds this whole section in the most fundamental strategic understanding. War, he reminds us, is the last argument of diplomacy. The means of warfare are always, or should always be, secondary to the political results, the end goal.
Right. Politics drives war.
Exactly. So while military principles must govern the action of war, war itself must sometimes consent to momentary modifications or deviations where specific political results are the immediate purpose. If politics dictates a certain movement is necessary for a political goal, strategy have to find a way to serve that political end, even if it's not ideal militarily in isolation.
He then clarifies the necessary intellectual discipline for naval planning, making a clear distinction between strategic and tactical thinking.
Yes, this is crucial for him. Strategic distribution is the fixed, long-term determination. It's based on those permanent, enduring factors we've talked about. Geography, national resources, the probable long-term war scenarios you might face. A strategic disposition is like building the permanent framework of a house. It should be stable, well thought out, and designed to expedite future adjustments when needed.
Okay, that's strategy. What about tactics?
Tactical movements, conversely, are the temporary changes you make to meet unforeseen immediate conditions. It's like reacting to a sudden storm hitting your house or responding to a momentary enemy maneuver you didn't expect. Strategy is the long-term plan. Tactics is execution and adaptation in the heat of the moment.
And the ultimate military goal that strategy must always pursue is what he calls the supreme offensive.
Absolutely. Mahan is relentless on this point. While passive defense might appeal to the timid or the budget-conscious, he is crystal clear. Offense alone means nothing short of victory. The fundamental decisive objective of the offensive is always, always the enemy's organized fighting force in naval terms, his main battle fleet. You can seize territory, you can blockade ports, but as long as the enemy's main fleet exists as a credible force, your control is temporary and potentially reversible. Once that enemy fleet is destroyed or neutralized, then command of the sea is achieved, and all other objectives protecting commerce, supporting land forces, blockading follow much more easily. Target the fleet first.
He also explains why certain types of states are inherently better positioned to pursue this supreme offensive than others.
Yeah, he notes that for an insular state like Great Britain, offense and defense can essentially be fulfilled by one factor, the command of the sea. If you control the sea around your island, your homeland is defended, and your offensive power can project anywhere in the world via that sea control.
Makes sense.
Continental states, however, like Germany or France or Russia, are inherently constrained by their land frontiers. They require massive land armies for defense, which inevitably splits resources and national focus, historically preventing them, Mahan argues, from ever establishing supreme, undivided sea power in the way Britain did. Their strategic attention is divided.
To illustrate this idea of strategic distribution, he zeroes in on a key piece of geography for European navies at the time, the Mediterranean. He calls it the Mediterranean crucible.
Right, because for European powers focused on the burgeoning competition in the Far East, the Mediterranean Sea is the most vital and critical link in an interior line of communication.
An interior line.
Think of it as the strategic highway connecting the home bases in Europe to the distant fighting sphere in Asia via the Suez Canal. Your naval strategy, your distribution of forces, must revolve around controlling the Mediterranean. The success or failure in a prolonged war for influence in the Far East will ultimately depend entirely upon who controls the Mediterranean, because that dictates who can move reinforcements, coal, troops, and supplies faster and safer to the theater of operations.
Lose the Med, you lose Asia?
In the long run, yes. Lose control of the Mediterranean and you effectively lose the battle for Asia, because your supply lines are cut or fatally slowed.
But all this naval action, all this strategy requires absolute synchronized unity of effort. And that leads us into his crucial and pretty high-stakes discussion of the military rule of obedience.
Yeah, this is where he gets almost philosophical about command. Mahan asserts flatly that the whole of military action is contained in the one word, unity. Unity of purpose, unity of command, unity of action. The rule of obedience is simply the mechanism that ensures many independent wills, all the captains, all the crews act together toward one single end. It makes the fleet become one will, realizing the commander's impulse throughout the entire mass.
And he really takes issue with the common civilian phrase, error of judgment, doesn't he? He thinks it's misleading in a military context.
Profoundly misleading, he argues, because some errors, he says, are simply inexcusable. They are inconsistent with the required professional knowledge and standards expected of an officer of a certain rank. And therefore, they're not just errors, they are misconduct. If you failed to meet the professional standard, if you should have known better based on your training and position, you are culpable. It's not just an oops moment.
This is where his analysis of Lord Nelson, arguably the greatest naval commander in British history, becomes so incredibly instructive. Because Nelson himself famously struggled with this exact question: when is it okay or even necessary to deviate from or ignore standing orders?
Nelson's internal debate on this was legendary. He wrestled with it constantly. His personal rule, as Mahan interprets it, was to obey the Great Order, the overarching strategic objective. Nelson himself said something like, "To serve my king and to destroy the French I consider as the great order of all, from which little ones spring."
The big picture first.
Right. If a little one, a specific detailed instruction from higher command, seemed to militate against achieving that strategic great order, Nelson would often default back to the spirit of the great order. This is strategic obedience, he argues, understanding and acting on the commander-in-chief's ultimate intent, not just blindly following the literal words of every signal flag.
But even Nelson, the hero, could cross the line. Mahan uses two specific contrasting cases of disobedience to show the subtle but absolutely crucial difference between justifiable strategic initiative, maybe, and catastrophic failure of unity. Let's look at Nelson's own instance first, where he got censured.
Okay, the first case involves Nelson, when he was serving in the Mediterranean, deliberately disobeying his commander-in-chief's direct orders to detach some of his ships to help secure the island of Minorca. Nelson, based on his own assessment of the volatile political situation in the Kingdom of Naples at that moment, felt that protecting the Neapolitan monarchy from falling to the French was strategically more vital right then than reinforcing the Minorca garrison as he'd been ordered.
So he made his own call on priorities.
He acted entirely on his own estimate of the relative strategic value of Naples versus Minorca. And Mahan's judgment here is clear. Nelson, quote, invaded the province which belonged to the commander-in-chief alone. He acted outside his delegated sphere of responsibility. Even though his action was arguably successful in helping to preserve Naples for a time, he was rightly censured by the Admiralty for misconduct. Why? Because he had usurped the commander-in-chief's unique prerogative to weigh the priorities across the entire theater of operations.
So it wasn't necessarily that his judgment about Naples was wrong in isolation, but that his action violated the principle of unity of command. He wasn't seeing the whole board.
Precisely. His action might have been strategically sound for Naples locally, but it was administratively and doctrinally unsound for the fleet as a whole. Only the commander-in-chief has the full picture to weigh all the competing demands and risks. Nelson overstepped.
Okay, so that's one type of disobedience, censorable, but maybe understandable given Nelson's character. Now, the contrasting case, where Mahan says error of judgment, was rightly rejected as any kind of excuse. That was Rear Admiral Mahan in 1796.
Yes, this is Mahan's critical example of sacrificing unity with disastrous results. The situation was, Admiral Mahan was ordered to take his division of ships to Gibraltar to get provisions, and then, crucially, to rejoin his commander, Admiral Jervis, who later became Earl St. Vincent, near Corsica. The fleet needed to be concentrated.
Oh.
While Mahan was sailing, he received intelligence that a superior Spanish fleet was nearby. Now, instead of fulfilling his orders to rejoin Jervis, perhaps reporting the intelligence but still proceeding, Mahan made the unilateral decision to take his entire division, a significant part of Jervis's fleet, all the way back to England. He essentially ran away.
He just abandoned his post and his commander?
He abandoned Jervis, leaving the main British Mediterranean fleet dangerously exposed and significantly weakened right at a critical moment.
That sounds less like an error of judgment and much more like, well, a failure of nerve that resulted in a catastrophic failure of strategic unity.
And Mahan confirms this interpretation absolutely. Mahan's choice was a complete failure to maintain unity. He made a tactical decision based on his own fear that completely undermined his commander's strategy for the entire theater. As a direct result, Mahan was deprived of his command and significantly was never employed afloat again. His career was over.
Wow.
Mahan stresses that in circumstances like these, if an officer's judgment, even if flawed, is translated into an overt act that sacrifices the paramount military objective of unity, then that officer should have known better. Professional competence, the standard you're held to, requires acting in concert with the commander's plan, not acting in isolation based on local fears.
This extremely high standard of professional competence, of self-control, of prioritizing unity, sets the stage perfectly for Mahan's final reflection in this collection, his personal assessment of one of his own contemporaries, a man he believed exemplified these very traits, Admiral William T. Sampson, the American commander during the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, Mahan brings in a very personal recollection here, which really humanizes the great strategist. Mahan recalls meeting Sampson way back at the Naval Academy in 1857. Mahan was actually 2 classes ahead of him. Samson at the time was just a, quote, raw country lad, apparently quite awkward. But Mahan says he stood out immediately because of his unusual inquisitive interest. He was always asking questions, trying to understand why.
That desire to know.
That compulsive desire to compel knowledge, as Mahan saw it, was the necessary foundation for Samson's exceptional intellectual capacity later in his career. It started early.
And Samson's career was also defined by this deep dedication to the service, and particularly to naval education, wasn't it?
Very much so. He was continuously associated with the Naval Academy throughout his career, eventually serving as its superintendent. Mahan notes he declined offers to remain permanently in less demanding shore roles, which showed, in Mahan's view, the mastery which the service had over his interests and affections. And crucially, it also showed his entire self-mastery in temper and under responsibility. He wasn't easily flustered.
What was the specific quality, according to Mahan, that made Samson such an effective commander, especially under the immense pressure of wartime command?
In a word, composure. Mahan quotes Admiral Jervis, Earl St. Vincent again. Responsibility is the test of a man's courage. Samson, Mahan believed, excelled here because he possessed this rare ability to rest with a quiet mind, to not be constantly troubled by fears of improbable eventualities. He didn't panic about everything that might go wrong, and crucially, linking back to Nelson, he possessed the power to take necessary risk for adequate ends.
He could weigh risk and reward calmly.
Calmly and decisively. And the Santiago blockade during the Spanish-American War proved that quality perfectly. The Spanish fleet under Admiral Cervera was bottled up inside Santiago Harbor in Cuba. This presented a major strategic dilemma for Samson and the U.S. Navy.
Right. How do you keep them trapped?
Exactly. The strategic problem was, how do you prevent the enemy fleet from escaping, especially at night, using the narrow harbor channel? They could be protected by mines, shore batteries, maybe even torpedo boats making a dash. Samson's decision was absolutely resolute. The risk of torpedo attack must be taken to prevent Cervera's escape. His order was totally uncompromising. The end to be attained justifies the risk of torpedo attack, and that risk must be taken. He followed that with the rationale. The escape of the Spanish squadron at this juncture would be a serious blow to our prestige and to a speedy end of the war. The stakes were too high to be overly cautious.
And his methods reflected that resolve. They were continuously stringent, which ultimately broke the enemy's will to just sit there passively.
They absolutely were. His continuous and increasing stringency of methods, as Mahan describes it, included positioning the main blockading battleships very close to the harbor entrance, much closer than comfort might suggest. And, most famously, using continuous illumination at night, powerful searchlights flooding the narrow channel mouth with light, making any attempt at a nighttime escape immediately detectable and subject to overwhelming fire.
No sneaking out?
No sneaking out. Mahan notes that this composure, this mental calm, translated directly into immediate, effective, and unrelenting tactical action. And it was this pressure, this tightening grip, that ultimately put the lid on Cervera's coffin, as Mahan vividly puts it. It forced the enemy commander to eventually accept battle by attempting to run the blockade in broad daylight, under the most disadvantageous terms possible for the Spanish fleet.
Compelling the enemy to fight on your terms.
That fulfillment of the highest strategic requirement, compelling the enemy's fleet to fight under conditions of your choosing, is perhaps the highest praise Mahan could give any naval commander. And he saw Samson as embodying that perfectly.
So this deep dive into Mahan's 1902 work, Retrospect and Prospect, it really reveals a strategist who was far more than just a naval historian. He was a brilliant, almost clairvoyant observer of emerging permanent geopolitical factors.
He really was. He accurately identified the irrevocable rise of the United States as a global actor, forced out of its comfortable little corner by its own internal economic momentum and, well, the convenient collapse of rivals like Spain.
Yeah.
He mapped out the critical strategic importance of Asia, specifically pointing to the commercially vital Yangtze-Kiang River Valley and the potentially explosive strategic railway terminus of the Persian Gulf, identifying these as the new fulcrums, the new pivot points of global power competition.
And he cemented, really for generations, the idea of enduring naval force, sea power, channeled effectively through strategic unity and high professional competence, which he saw epitomized by commanders like Samson. It's actually striking when you think about it, how many of his core observations remain foundational or at least highly relevant today. That fundamental tension between, say, a protectionist policy that maybe encourages complacency and a global trade policy that demands constant competitive excellence.
Still a debate today.
Absolutely. The clear necessity of naval forces, or perhaps now air and space forces too, to protect global commercial interests and supply lines. And that perpetual difficulty of maintaining unified action and shared burdens across vast, heterogeneous political bodies, whether it was the British Empire then, or you could argue modern global alliances today.
Yeah, those challenges haven't gone away.
Mm.
Mahan consistently urged nations to be guided by what he called reasoned interests controlled by justice, not by fleeting passion or temporary political prejudice. And considering the breathtaking speed of global change he witnessed just between 1890 and 1900, a transformation that, as we said, he openly admitted surprised even him, this leaves us with a crucial question for you, the listener, today.
Mahan said that those permanent factors, things like geography, resources, the momentum of commercial or technological expansion, will always, eventually, dictate the policy that is necessary, whether we like it or not. So the question is, what permanent factors in our current global environment right now are we failing to consult? What realities are we perhaps ignoring because they conflict with a cherished political tradition, maybe an outdated view of the world?
Or maybe just because they demand an expenditure of effort or a change in thinking that we're currently unwilling to make.
Hmm.
Mahan saw the end of the Spanish Empire and the irresistible rise of global commercial pressure as the irreversible forces of his time, forcing nations like the U.S. to grow up, to look outward. Which geopolitical little corner are we currently ignoring today? Is it a strategic waterway we take for granted? Is it a rapidly developing technological sphere where we're falling behind? Is it an impending resource crisis or an environmental shift we're not adequately preparing for?
What necessary policy are we resisting because it conflicts with the comfortable letter of our past traditions rather than the demanding spirit of our true long-term national or even global interest?
It's a question that really requires the same kind of clear-eyed, non-prejudiced, long-view observation that Mahan applied so effectively over a century ago. Something to think about.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Mahan's remarkably prescient look at the future of global power from the dawn of the 20th century. We'll see you next time.